On the morning of the 24th of February 2026, a private courier bearing the discreet insignia of the royal household pulled into the tree-lined approach of a Montecito residence that had, over the preceding 4 years, become the most scrutinized private address in the English-speaking world. There was no announcement. No prior notification had been sent through any of the usual channels. No palace communications officer had briefed a counterpart on the Sussex side. No lawyer had called ahead. The courier carried a single sealed document inside a burgundy portfolio, embossed with a reference number that meant nothing to the security staff who received it, and everything to the financial and legal advisors who would be summoned to review it within the hour. By mid-morning, 4 people were seated around a table in the property's private office. By early afternoon, 2 more had been called in. And by the time the California sun had begun its descent behind the Pacific horizon, the atmosphere inside that house had acquired the particular quality of stillness that only descends when something large and irreversible has just become real. Before we begin today's royal update, I want to take a quick moment. Many of you enjoy these videos but haven't subscribed yet, and you definitely don't want to miss the latest developments and fascinating stories from the world of royalty. Subscribing is completely free and helps you stay up to date as every new royal moment unfolds. And while you're here, let us know, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see viewers joining us from all around the world. The document was 43 pages long. It was formally headed as a Notice of Financial Liability Recovery, and it had been authorized, signed, and sealed by the Office of the Privy Purse with a directness that left no procedural ambiguity about its standing or its intent. What it contained was a precisely itemized accounting of financial obligations totaling $59 million, accumulated across a period beginning with the Sussex transition from senior royal duties in January 2020, and extending through a series of arrangements, expenditures and cost absorptions that had never been publicly disclosed in their full detail. The categories were specific, and the figures beside each were not estimates. They were documented. Security provision costs drawn from protected royal funding streams during the transitional period, before private arrangements were finalised. Legal cost recoveries related to proceedings in which the Crown had provided structural support without formal reimbursement agreements in place. Operational expenditure associated with the Sussex household during its final period of institutional royal affiliation. And a 4th category, listed last and carrying the largest single figure in the document, described only as deferred sovereign obligations, a phrase whose precise legal meaning Harry's advisors would spend the remainder of that day attempting to fully decode. To understand why the document landed with the force that it did, one must understand what Harry had believed, or had allowed himself to believe about the financial architecture of his post-royal life. The years since the Sussexes' departure from senior duties had been, on the surface, a story of aggressive and largely successful commercial self-construction. The Netflix deal, the Spotify arrangement however it ended, the memoir whose advance had broken publishing records, the speaking engagements, the brand affiliations, the California life built visibly and deliberately on the premise that 2 people had walked away from an institution and built something of their own, independently and on their own terms. That narrative had been central not merely to their public identity, but to Harry's private self-understanding. He had left. He had built. He had, he believed, covered the distance between what he was born into and what he had chosen to become with enough financial substance to make the crossing irreversible. What the 43-page document suggested, with the cold precision of a formally authorized legal instrument, was that the crossing had never been entirely paid for, and that the institution he had crossed away from had been keeping the ledger all along. The calls began within 90 minutes of the document being opened. Harry's primary legal representative reached out to 2 senior financial advisors and a crisis communications consultant before noon. A former palace intermediary, one of the few figures who maintained irregular but functional contact with both the Sussex household and certain palace-adjacent circles, received a call that afternoon that was described by someone aware of its content as unlike any conversation Harry had initiated in recent memory. He wasn't angry, this person said. He was quiet in a way that was harder to read than anger. Like someone doing arithmetic in their head and not liking where the numbers were landing. What the arithmetic was revealing, as Harry's advisors worked through the document's implications against the background of their client's actual current financial position, was a picture considerably more complicated than the public narrative of Sussex commercial success had suggested. The production entity that had anchored their content strategy had been restructured. Certain brand partnership agreements that had been understood as ongoing had been quietly wound down. And a preliminary review of the joint asset position, initiated by Harry's own team as a routine first step in preparing any legal response to the royal invoice, had returned results that caused the meeting to pause in a way that had nothing to do with the $59 million figure at its center. There are moments in financial and personal crisis when the thing that breaks a person is not the blow they saw coming, but the one that was already waiting behind it. The royal invoice was a blow Harry had not anticipated, but could, in theory, have prepared a response to. What his advisor's preliminary asset review began to uncover in the hours that followed its arrival was something for which no preparation had been made, because Harry had not known it was coming, because Harry had not known it was happening. The $59 million demand from the palace was not, it was becoming horrifyingly clear, the most significant financial revelation of that February morning. It was the one that had forced open the door behind which the more significant revelation had been quietly waiting. And what was behind that door had not been put there by the king, or by the palace, or by any of the institutional forces Harry had spent 4 years identifying as the architects of his difficulties. It had been put there much closer to home, by someone he had trusted with everything, and the full shape of what they had done was only just beginning to come into focus. There is a specific kind of betrayal that does not arrive with a confrontation or a confession or even a moment of visible rupture. It arrives instead through a spreadsheet, through a column of figures that do not add up the way they should, through the quiet, clinical language of financial documents that have been prepared with care and executed with precision by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and made a deliberate decision to do it without telling the person most affected by the outcome. For Harry, that moment arrived on the afternoon of the 24th of February 2026, in the same private office where his advisors had spent the morning working through the palace's $59 million invoice. The royal document had been set aside temporarily while a routine asset review was conducted. It was not routine for long. Within 40 minutes of beginning that review, Harry's lead financial advisor stopped the meeting, asked the 2 junior members of the team to leave the room, and told Harry directly that what the preliminary figures were showing required an immediate and private conversation. That conversation lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Harry sat alone in the room for a further 30 minutes before anyone was permitted to re-enter. What he had been told in those 2 hours has since been pieced together through sources close to his inner circle, with a clarity that makes the full picture impossible to look away from. Beginning in approximately mid-2024, a systematic and carefully structured process of asset separation had been executed within the financial architecture of the Sussex household. It had not happened overnight, and it had not happened carelessly. It had happened in stages, each individually unremarkable, each justifiable on its own terms if examined in isolation, but collectively forming a pattern whose overall direction was unmistakable to anyone reviewing the full sequence. The production entity that had been established as the primary vehicle for the couple's content and commercial strategy had been quietly restructured through a series of amendments to its beneficial ownership arrangements. Those amendments, executed through a private California holding company, had the effect of concentrating the entity's residual value in a configuration that did not reflect the joint ownership structure Harry had understood to be in place. Brand partnership agreements that Harry had understood as ongoing joint commercial relationships had been individually wound down, and in several cases, replaced by successor arrangements registered under a separate entity, whose beneficial ownership was solely and unambiguously Meghan's. A real estate maneuver involving a property asset held within the Sussex portfolio had been executed through the same private holding company, transferring the asset's equity position in a transaction that was entirely legal, entirely undisclosed to Harry, and entirely consequential to the joint financial picture his advisors had believed they were managing. Meghan had retained independent financial counsel in March of 2024. This detail, confirmed by 2 sources with knowledge of the engagement, is perhaps the single most telling element of the entire financial picture because of what its timing reveals. March 2024 was not a period of visible marital crisis. It was not a moment when the Sussex public narrative had fractured or when any external observer would have identified a relationship under terminal strain. It was, by the standards of the couple's public presentation, an unremarkable period of continued commercial activity and managed visibility. The decision to retain independent financial counsel at that specific moment, without disclosure to Harry, and without any corresponding adjustment to the joint financial management arrangements that remained nominally in place, was not a reactive decision made under pressure. It was a proactive one made in anticipation of a future that had already been privately mapped. The advice Meghan received from that counsel, according to a source familiar with the engagement's general parameters, centered on the legal distinction between personal and jointly held assets under California law, and the specific mechanisms available for restructuring shared financial arrangements in ways that were both legally defensible and not subject to mandatory disclosure requirements within the timeframes that would have made interception possible. Harry had not been told. That fact, simple and devastating in equal measure, sits at the center of everything that followed. The trusted friends who had watched the Montecito household from close proximity during 2024 and into 2025 describe a Harry who was, by every external indicator, operating on the assumption that the financial partnership of his marriage remained what it had always presented itself as being. He was engaged in his own commercial activities, his speaking engagements, his advisory roles, his ongoing legal proceedings against British press entities, with the confidence of a man who believed his broader financial foundation was stable and jointly maintained. One former associate who remained in periodic contact with Harry throughout that period said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. He trusted her with the architecture of his life out there. He had no reason not to. And she knew that. The one former palace aide who had raised a concern, obliquely and without full knowledge of the specifics, 18 months before the invoice arrived, had told Harry in the autumn of 2024 that something about the financial structures around him did not feel symmetrical. Harry had not pursued it. He had, according to those who knew him during that period, interpreted the observation as an artifact of old palace world suspicion toward Meghan rather than as a legitimate signal worth investigating. That decision, to trust rather than verify, would become one of the defining miscalculations of his post-royal life. The $59 million invoice from the palace had arrived, and it was real, and it was serious, and it demanded a response. But the response it demanded required a clear picture of the assets available to meet it. And that picture, when it finally came into focus on the afternoon of the 24th of February 2026, showed Harry something he had not been prepared to see. He was not looking at a jointly held portfolio, capable of absorbing a significant legal and financial challenge. He was looking at what remained after 18 months of careful, deliberate, and entirely unilateral restructuring. He was looking, in other words, at almost nothing, and he was looking at it alone. There is a version of this story that casts the $59 million invoice as an act of royal vengeance, a father's institutional fury weaponized against a son who had spent 4 years dismantling the monarchy's reputation from a Californian hillside. That version is simpler and more satisfying than the truth. The truth, as reconstructed through sources with proximity to the palace's internal deliberations during the autumn and winter of 2025, is considerably more cold-blooded and considerably more calculated than revenge. Revenge is emotional. What Charles authorized was not emotional. It was procedural. It was the product of a months-long legal and financial review conducted by a small and carefully selected group of advisors who had identified a specific window of opportunity, created not by royal anger, but by the collapse of the very financial architecture that had, until recently, made recovering the liability practically impossible. Charles did not send the bill because Harry had hurt him. He sent it because Harry could no longer make it disappear. And the person most responsible for ensuring Harry could no longer make it disappear was not anyone inside the palace. It was Meghan. The internal deliberation began in September 2025. A senior legal advisor attached to the Privy Purse Office had been conducting a routine review of outstanding transitional financial arrangements from the Sussex departure period, when the preliminary findings of Meghan's asset restructuring began to surface through the kind of institutional financial monitoring that operates quietly and continuously beneath the public life of the monarchy. What the review identified was not, at that stage, a complete picture, but it was enough to trigger a formal escalation to a more senior level of palace legal counsel, and eventually to a private meeting between that council and a small circle of advisors whose access to Charles was direct and whose discretion was absolute. The meeting took place in the third week of October 2025. Its conclusion, reached after 3 sessions spanning nearly 2 weeks, was that the conditions necessary for a formal recovery of the outstanding liability had been met in a way they had not been at any prior point since the Sussex departure. The window was open. The question was whether to step through it. Princess Anne's contribution to that deliberation has since been described by those present as decisive. She had been invited into the process not as a family member, but in her capacity as the most institutionally rigorous senior royal, the one whose judgment on matters of precedent and long-term constitutional consequence carried a weight that others in the room deferred to without resentment. Her argument was straightforward, and to those who heard it, irrefutable. The continued absorption of financial liabilities generated by a member of the family who had formally and publicly renounced his working royal role was not an act of generosity. It was an act of institutional weakness that set a precedent no responsible steward of the Crown's financial integrity could justify maintaining. The liabilities were documented. The legal basis for recovery was sound. The practical obstacles that had previously existed had been removed, not by the palace, but by decisions made within the Sussex household itself. To fail to act under these circumstances was not compassion. It was negligence. Charles listened. He did not respond immediately. He asked for one further legal opinion from an external counsel with no prior palace connection. That opinion, delivered in the second week of November 2025, confirmed everything the internal review had found. Charles authorised the invoice on the 19th of November. It was not sent until February. The intervening months were used to ensure that every figure in the 43-page document was unimpeachable. William's position throughout this period has been the subject of considerable internal speculation and considerable external misreading. Those who have portrayed him as the driving force behind the invoice's issuance are wrong. Those who have portrayed him as an innocent bystander with no knowledge of the process are equally wrong. William knew. He had been informed of the deliberation at the point where Charles made the decision to seek an external legal opinion, a gesture his father made partly out of procedural thoroughness and partly, sources suggest, out of a desire to ensure that his elder son could not later claim to have been excluded from a decision with significant family consequences. William's response to being informed was neither enthusiastic support nor opposition. It was silence. A considered, deliberate, and fully understood silence that those close to him describe as the most painful position he has occupied since his mother's death. He did not want to be the instrument of his brother's financial destruction. He also could not, in conscience, argue that the liability should continue to be absorbed by an institution whose integrity he would one day be solely responsible for protecting. His silence was not indifference. It was the sound of a man who had run out of ways to protect someone who had stopped making protection possible. Charles signed the formal authorization alone, late on a November evening. A handwritten note was attached to the file. Those who have seen it describe its contents as 2 sentences long, equal parts grief and necessity, the words of a father who had finally accepted that love and accountability were not, in this instance, things that could be reconciled. The note has not been disclosed. It may never be. In the weeks following the financial revelation, those closest to Harry describe a man who has stopped performing. Not in the public sense, though his visible engagements have thinned considerably since February. In the private sense, the careful narrative management, the deliberate positioning, the perpetual construction of a story about himself that justified every decision and absolved every cost, all of it has gone quiet. What remains, according to one person who has spent significant time with him during this period, is something rawer and more recognizable than anything the public version of Harry has allowed itself to be in years. He is, for perhaps the first time since leaving, simply a man trying to understand how he arrived at this specific place, and what, if anything, he is willing to do about it. The legal response to the palace invoice is being prepared. Senior counsel has been retained. Back-channel approaches to palace intermediaries have been made with a tentativeness that sources describe as unlike Harry's usual instinct toward confrontation, suggesting that the appetite for another public battle with the institution has been significantly diminished by the private battles now consuming his attention. Whether a negotiated settlement is possible remains unclear. Whether Harry has the financial position to contest the full liability, if negotiation fails, is a question his advisors are still working to answer with the incomplete picture the asset restructuring has left them. The state of the Sussex marriage is not something Harry has addressed publicly or privately in terms that constitute a definitive statement. But the architecture of his current situation speaks with a clarity that words have not been asked to provide. Separate advisors, diverging strategies, a household that multiple sources now describe as operating on parallel tracks whose intersection grows less frequent with each passing month. The communication confirming the permanent nature of Meghan's asset restructuring was delivered through legal representatives, not through a conversation. That detail, small and enormously telling, has not been lost on anyone paying attention. What Harry does next will define not the legacy the palace assigned him, but the one he actually earns. He came to California carrying the weight of a family he had declared broken and a system he had declared corrupt. He built a life on the architecture of that declaration. And now, stripped of the financial foundation he believed he had, facing a liability he cannot easily absorb, and navigating a partnership whose terms were quietly rewritten without him, he stands at the kind of crossroads that does not offer comfortable directions. Only honest ones. The crown he walked away from has sent him a bill. The life he walked toward has sent him a reckoning. What remains is the question every man must eventually answer when everything external has been removed. Not who were you born to be, but who, when it finally costs you everything, do you choose to become?